Welcome back here with Goldberg. Today we're going to be talking about the culture of credentialism and qualifications. Modern society's fixation on the piece of paper and not so much the experience or competencies lying behind it. So this is something that was pointed out in the higher education realm back in the 1970s, that you had a lot of students gaining degrees, but the question was, how do you verify if they've actually learned anything, if they're qualified to operate in that field or profession? And then clearly in the private sector, you have the cartelization increasingly, the rise of these certification bodies, where it used to be a one-time ordeal. Now after 3 years, usually they expire. You have to spend copious amounts of money to renew or get a higher level certification. And you have licensing and regulation. So this is probably meant for a separate video in of itself, but someone pointed out in some states you need a license to be a florist. In my state, to run a small online business where you have no inventory in your house, you have to have an expensive business license. To have a yard sale or a lemonade stand, you need a permit. I mean, this is the type of overbearing government that should actually be fixated on, but it still occurs in conservative, controlled parts of the country. That, to me, is overstep. So it's like, start with the small stuff, then move up to the feds if you want to. But in any case, before we get started, I wanted to propose a general mandatory certification for all people as sort of a means of being accepted into the human race, okay? And it would essentially be the following: a very rigorous examination to prove that the person understands fallacies. Yeah, that's right. How many times you have an interaction with a person and they'll just go, "Oh, that's a straw man." No, just because you didn't anticipate something about your arguments and it was exploited does not mean it's a straw man, or you disagree with them. It's ad hominem. Oh, you're moving the goalposts too much. Translation, they don't actually understand the arguments. No True Scotsman is definitely my favorite as well. And what happens is these are folks who are trying to emulate others that they perceive to be intelligent using specific forms of language. It's the reason why they will tend to look towards maybe Jordan Peterson, Michael Eric Dyson, these word salad experts. And I'm not trying to cast shade on those men because they have valid ideas, but oftentimes it's a simple idea wrapped up in all this, mopey-dopey lingo. And if someone just says, it could be said simpler, then the fanboys will go, "Oh, obvious example of the Dunning-Kruger effect." So I guarantee they haven't actually read the studies behind Dunning-Kruger or any of these other laws and effects. It's just, I want to sound like the supposedly smart person. And that could really be addressed with a ironclad certification, very expensive but very demanding if you want to be a human being. Just my proposal real quick. But now we can get into the rest of the video. So a first stop obviously will be medicine. And I pointed out in another segment that primary care physicians, for what they're doing, do not need 10 years of education. It upset many folks. But you think about it, a person wears a white coat and they've got an MD, PhD, and they go on national television and tell you, do whatever Dr. Fauci says, Fauci the entertainer. And that's when you have to really call into question all that education and training, because they're just shilling for the system. Not to mention the fact that a lot of what doctors do is just write prescriptions. And they'll do that before even considering, well, how can we solve this in a natural way? I think it's tragic for all the doctors we have of like East Asian, South Asian descent, where those diets are correlated with better health outcomes. And yet they've adapted to the American way of life. Many of the ones that I know in their own personal lives, they eat a lot of fast food, drink a lot of soda, doctors, yes. And then, they'll just write a prescription. It's like, why don't you put that person on a regimen of, you're going to change your everyday behavior and consumption before we're going to give you some medication with a lot of negative side effects. But then I guess in a way that would take away the whole mystique of, this is the doctor who he does something for you. He gives you the medicine. That's the wrong way to look at health, however, okay? But of course, if we're going into being a surgeon, being a specialist, I understand more training. But the primary care physicians, Not much justification in my book for that. Another area you see this credentialism is in the IT sector. So the first cert I got, which was from Coursera, was like $200. Then I did another from CompTIA that was a little over $300 if I recall. I did an ITIL cert that was like about $400. And I've been eyeing next on the list Ethical Hacker, which that thing in of itself, because you have to take a class for it depending on your background, just for the cert itself, it's $3,000. And then if you want to do a dual thing with pen test, which is another up-and-coming cert, it's almost $5,000. And you say, well, yeah, but you're going to be able to make money from it. But why is this certificate so expensive? It's not a college degree program. It's not necessarily proof of skills or experience. It just means you can study enough, remember facts, and spit them out in a several-hour session. But this is what they obsess over, and that's because you have to understand it's a massive business. So you got the industry itself trying to protect oversupply, as I talked about in the other video. You've got these credentialing bodies that are making a lot of money, especially when they require you to renew them. And then you also have the testing centers and the proctoring services online, which are making a great amount of money. So it's just that whole cycle, and that's why I don't see it unless maybe the government steps in and starts capping stuff, or the private sector just says we don't care anymore about these certs. It's going to remain. It's probably going to get worse, and an entry-level cert will be like $1,000 in the future. No joke there, if you ask me. Now, one area that I think credentialism and degrees is often perhaps not valued enough, especially in the circles where we operate, would be psychology. Because, you know, you can always say, well, why don't you just pick up a book at the library and then read some? And that's legitimate, okay, and you should be reading. But one of the problems is if you allow your own biases to control what you're going to investigate, there is a very risky possibility that you will dismiss if you come into contact with someone and you say, I'm going to help this person, but I don't need the degrees. You may very well dismiss certain symptoms or behaviors they're exhibiting, which could be a sign of their progress, by going back to your own biases. And I say this particularly when it comes to men and mental health for men. We saw recently, I think it was Renegade 1, tragically, I think he took his own life. And you really ask yourself, because in right-wing and manosphere circles, there's a lot of bashing of psychology, saying that psychology is BS. And I believe some of this comes from the fact that in politics, people often try to use their own lay understanding of Freud to psychoanalyze and delegitimize a position. And I'm not a fan of that myself, but nevertheless, we shouldn't dismiss the value of actually exploring these things, because the outcome of that kind of ignorance can be very devastating. The reality is that for a lot of men from childhood, they are taught to not show any emotion, right? And even if you get into a circle, well, yeah, this is a circle for men. If a guy's trying to be open and honest, they'll still be shut down. And what do you hear most of the time? You hear, suck it up or be a man. Two phrases which have done more damage to human civilization than probably any others. Because just for the fact that you tell someone to suppress it doesn't mean it goes away. And a lot of men in childhood, like I said, can't show emotion. Girls, women can show emotion, no problem. Men cannot. But it festers and it grows, and it typically becomes anger. And you can't demonstrate anger, because if you do that publicly, you're going to end up probably in the loony bin or, locked up. So maybe you could get it out if you're in combat sports. Otherwise, you come on the internet, and that's where you get all the rage pilling. The rage pilling is a stage, but if it doesn't, progress from that to a healing, you can get people that they just generate more rage upon the rage, and then they get to the point of depression, and sometimes they take their own life. Sometimes they might take the life of other people. That's why knowledge of psychology, investigation into it, is very important. I've actually considered going into that, even though it would be kind of a laborious process at this point. But we need to be fixating more on how people are thinking and feeling, because all the anger, all the animosity, that's not solving any problems. You can do a little bit of a release valve yet to begin with, but you don't see that much progress, and it can actually just start spiraling into something worse. So I do think psychology should be held up in a higher level. And the truth is, if you really want to be exposed to a lot of these ideas, if you want to challenge your own biases, which those biases could prevent you from helping someone, because you might just tell them, shut up and be a man, which is not helping their actual situation over time. So yeah, I do think that there should be more of a focus, both men and women, but especially men, because men is the one where it's like, oh, psychology is BS, I'm not going to talk to anyone. That is not helpful. So certainly when it comes to credentials, it does take more years, it does take more effort, but it doesn't mean it should be totally delegitimized. I also think it's important to point out sometimes the people who will bash credentials a whole lot are doing so on the basis of their inability to achieve something. So there's a guy who promotes the raw meat diet, who I believe had his medical license suspended, and his justification was, oh, I got screwed over by the system. I don't know the specifics of it, but usually you have to try pretty hard to lose your medical license. So it's always kind of suspect. And you have to be aware of that. I know another dude who went to one of those alternative healing schools, managed to get himself kicked out, and then said, oh, I'm too brilliant for everyone there. No. That is the singular indication of someone who they had a personal issue they didn't address. So you have to be aware of that, but it's always going to be a balancing act. Credentialism can lead to what we talked about earlier, shilling for Dr. Fauci. Lack of credentialism, though, can just allow your biases and lack of training to supersede actually benefiting someone and improving their life, if that's what you're trying to do, or even your own position.